Hi, my name is Akeem Lloyd, and I am the founder of a Leadership Journey youth leadership and travel nonprofit organization located in Providence, Rhode Island. And Juneteenth means a lot to me, especially when you talk about the work of our ancestors. Because of the work of our ancestors, they put in so much energy, so much grit, so much perseverance to make sure that we have a platform today. And so acknowledging the history of America, not Black America, but the history of America is so important when talking about how America was built. And being able to recognize why Black history is important is to say that we will not forget our history. We will not let young people who look like me grow up forgetting what their ancestors have done to help give them the opportunities that they have today. It's extremely important that we honor those who came before us and the tragedies that they went through. To be able to experience all of that and say that we are still here speaks a lot about our roots and the perseverance that our people have.
Hi, this is Jim Vincent, president of the NAACP Providence branch, and Juneteenth to me is a holiday celebrating the emancipation of those who have been enslaved in the United States.
Happy Juneteenth. As we commemorate this holiday and think about how our ancestors fought for freedom and justice, this holiday is a critical opportunity for us to take a step back and not only honor where we've been, but to also take a stock of what we have ahead. The work continues on our road towards freedom and justice for all Americans.
And Senator Rita, the program's over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you, Akeem, Jim, and Angie for sharing your reflections on Juneteenth. As Akeem noted, honoring Juneteenth is about honoring our history, and that is why we are here today. As we mark the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, it is chilling how effectively this heinous crime against the thriving African American community was buried and willfully forgotten. It's time to remember, time to honor, and time to atone. If we want to bend the arc of history towards justice, we need to be honest and inclusive about that history. This can be unnerving. We see a mobilization in some quarters against this effort, but we also see a reason for hope. And this is why June 10th inspires me. I'm pleased to join the Rhode Island Committee in presenting the virtual tour of the National Museum of American History and Culture with curator Bill Pretzer. Thank you, Bill. To help put us in the right mindset, we have invited our Deputy Youth Poetry Ambassador, Eugenia Rose, engineering, and she is an advocate for the community and is an incredible young lady. She's a 15-year-old poet from Providence. She attends the Providence Career Technical Center, where she studies pre-engineering. And she's a living example of this generation's ability to harness the power of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. She's an advocate for her community and is working to make real positive change for a much more just society. And welcome, Eugenia. Please go ahead.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Excuse me. This is a poem that I have entitled Butterfly of Power in Light and in Darkness. Is it you or is it them? The clock strikes midnight, the clouds floating in the darkness, walking down the streets, nobody in sight, invisible to the humans and their rights. Is it you or is it them? Maybe equality might not exist for all. After all, when other people could run and all you could do is crawl, is it you or is it them? Everyone deserves respect. Oh, how it is so easy to say, sometimes just too easy. It becomes worthless. Is it you or is it them? If we could choose who we were going to be, everyone might be a millionaire, living a dream, same skin color, same culture, same race, of what could be described as perfect. But isn't it good to be different? Is it you or is it them? If you face it yourself, it might make you think, is it their fault? Your answer is no. But every time you chose to stare, judge, and look away, disgusted, like they are no longer human, just because of their race. I grow. I struggle. I am not nurtured, nor cared for. I learn the harsh lessons of life alone. Then, satisfied in my growth, having learnt my lessons, I gain maturity. I am ready for change. I build walls around myself to protect the change, for change I must. I hang, waiting patiently. Change must occur, for what else is left? I push now. I am patient, but I am also impatient. I have waited long enough. It is time. I'll show this world that I can survive. One side of me is exposed to the world, then another, slowly at first, for I do not wish to shock, only to dazzle. Released am I, free, free to show myself in all of my glory, in all of my splendor, for I have changed. I am now who I'm meant to be. I'm finally me. So fear not to change. It comes naturally. Be brave, learn well, and when the time comes, be free. If your dreams do not scare you, they are not big enough. We seek freedom and liberation from the deceitful foundations of our nation, infringe with sacred rights and justice. Can we find hope through the darkness? Black blood is not cheap. Oh, how sorrowful mothers weep. Black blood is excessively shed, while the innocent fill prison beds. When will it end? While strolling down the street, or envisioning the future in your sleep, while playing with your toys, bullets, and casings of alloy, the sirens when all goes quiet. Where is our protection? Don't count the days, they say. Make the days count. All the shades of earth or sand must unite hand in hand. While the uniform take our young, our fist will not be hung. The savage successors of our lands have engraved corrupted plans. Our future will not be black with darkness, only but with light. And as Muhammad Ali said, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Thank you.
No, thank you, Eugenia. It was marvelous, eloquent, touching, sheer poetry. And now I'd like to invite Helen Baskerville Dukes, who has been a partner for today's event, as well as one of the driving forces behind Rhode Island's annual Juneteenth celebration, to say a few words. Helen, please.
Hi, Senator Reed. Um, Thank you guys so much. We are, well, as the Juneteenth committee president, I'm honored to be here, and it's wonderful to see that we are acknowledging the history of America, and excited to experience the presentation by Bill. I want to make sure I say your name right, Dr. Pretzer, and just thank you so much for inviting us.
Well, Helen, thank you very much for all your work. And now it's time to turn to our main attraction, and that's Dr. William Bill Pretzer, and he'll take us on a virtual tour of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Bill is the senior curator of history at the museum, a position he has held since 2009, before the museum opened to the public, which was in 2016. He co-curated one of the museum's inaugural exhibitions, A Changing America, 1968 and Beyond. He has produced exhibitions and educational programs written articles and book chapters on African American social history, 19th century labor history, and the history of technological innovation, as well as contemporary technology education and the practice of public history. We're grateful for his willingness to share his time, expertise, and the many resources of the museum. Take it away, please, Bill.
Thank you very much, Senator. It's a real pleasure to be here. Waiting for the slides to come up. Thank you, Aaron. You will hear me say okay a number of times in this presentation, and that is the clue for Aaron to advance the slides. We're using our technology as safely as we can today, given the weather conditions and the connections between the Washington, D.C. area and Rhode Island. We all now have enough experience after a full year of this kind of presentation to understand that we need to have a backup system, and we've gone to that with this presentation. Thank you very much, Senator, for you and your staff and your colleagues in Rhode Island making this invitation to us. When Lonnie Bunch was named the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2005, he had no collection of artifacts or photographs with which to build a museum. It's hard to do a museum if you don't have stuff. Stuff is a technical term museum people use for those historic artifacts and documents. He had no staff. He had no budget. He had the promise of money from Congress that amounted to about half of the $500 million expected cost of building the museum. But that money had to be appropriated annually, piece by piece, by Congress. He had designated for the building, no architect for the building, and therefore obviously no building. 11 years later, working with a very large team of people, Lonnie was able to open the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which, as he said, was not a museum of Black history for Black people, but rather a history for all Americans to see and place the history of Black Americans and the experience of Black culture at the center of the American experience. So the combination of the Washington Monument with the facade of the museum is a fitting symbol to begin a discussion that places the Juneteenth celebration into historical context. Okay. The museum architecture has raised many questions for people. It looks very much unlike the rest of the buildings on the National Mall, which, if you've ever seen those photographs, are almost uniformly of white sandstone. As Lonnie put it, he wanted a darker presence on the mall. And so the symbolism of this dark gold building, which actually changes with the sunlight, represents that desire to illustrate the diversity of American culture. The style of the building, the facade and the outline of the building drew many comments. Was it a slave ship? Was it the crown of an African king? Was it merely a woman tat? Was it a wicker basket? And the answer is, frankly, that David Adjaye, the African-born chief architect of the building, was inspired by an early 20th century piece of architecture that was capped with a caryatid, that is 3 inverted triangles. And those 3 inverted triangles give a sense of uplift, which was the idea behind the building. It is not about being sunk in the ground, although it starts in the ground, but rather this notion of a history of the resiliency and the effort toward American and African American progress. Okay, please. The building actually begins underground and moves upward through a series of both office spaces and public spaces and exhibitions. But it begins below ground. Nearly half of the building's total volume is found in the concourse levels and the below levels where the mechanical structures are placed. In fact, the concourse levels contain half of the exhibition space of the museum, and the exhibits are arranged in two different ways. The concourse level is basically a chronology, a textbook, if you will, running from the late 15th century into the early 21st century in chronological order with three major exhibitions. The rest of the exhibits upstairs on levels 3 and 4 are arranged topically, not chronologically. So an exhibit on the military experience, an exhibit on musical crossroads and culture, an exhibit on popular culture, an exhibit on sports, all arranged topically. But the chronological organization, which is actually one half of the museum's exhibitions, is all I'm able to illustrate this morning. And even then, it's merely looking at the tip of the iceberg. So we're going to start and stop in the concourse levels in a chronological history of African American history and culture, but trying to insert the history of Juneteenth into that context, to provide historical context for the different events that prompted Juneteenth to become what it is only recently, not a formal national holiday, yet a holiday and a commemoration that is recognized throughout the nation. Okay, please. So beginning in that concourse level, a full 3 stories below grade, we begin with an exhibition on slavery and freedom from the late 15th century into the mid-19th century. And the small quote just to the right of the exhibition's title, quote from John Hope Franklin, the eminent African-American historian of African-American history. We've got to tell the unvarnished truth. Again, echoing what Senator Reed and others have already said this morning. So this museum set out to tell the unvarnished truth about the African-American experience in all of its diversity and in all of its depth. Next, please. We start after discovering and exploring, if you will, elements of the two major cultures, the European culture, again, which has its diversity within it, and an African culture, again, with myriad diversities of religion, language, social systems, but nevertheless, what is looked at from the other side as something that is unifying, that has something that carries with it and a vibrancy and a sense of we can look at this and without making it unidimensional, we can at least say we're going to go to Africa and then look at the various parts of Africa, just as you would say we're going to go to Europe and look at the diversity within Europe. But what transpires over the first 2.5 centuries of this interaction between Europeans and Africans is the largest forced migration of human beings in human history. 12.5 million Africans, various cultures, are literally kidnapped, placed on ships, and transported to the Western Hemisphere. Of those 12.5 million souls, approximately 2 million die en route in the course of traversing the Atlantic Ocean. Thus the phrase, the Black Holocaust and the Middle Passage. Of those 10 million who arrive in the New World, the Caribbean, Latin America, and North America, only 400,000 are brought to what become the United States, the original colonies on the North American seacoast, eastern seacoast. The rest are taken to the Caribbean or to Latin America, largely Brazil. Next, please. That Middle Passage is, as we noted, one of the major elements in the African-American experience. It is a legacy that we continue today. We understand the impact. We better understand the impact of that legacy. And the museum has been privileged to be part of an international collaborative searching for slave wrecks in the ocean. And just before we opened, our partners in South Africa and partners at Scuba Divers with a difference, an organization of African-American scuba divers who volunteer their services. There was the discovery of a slave wreck just off of the coast of South Africa. And from that shipwreck, the underwater archaeologist retrieved some material. Specifically, the 3 iron ingots in front of you are the type of iron ingots that were used as ballast in slave ships. So whenever a slave wreck is examined, looking for those ballast pieces, those ingots, which represent more or less one human body to equal the weight of the ship when it's free of individuals, is a telltale key that this was a slaver. And those ingots come from the ship the São José, a Portuguese slaver that sank in 1794 off of the coast of South Africa. 200 enslaved individuals drowned at the moment of the sinking. The other 300 individuals on that ship, enslaved individuals, were placed on another ship and taken to Brazil to live out their days as enslaved individuals in Brazil. It's the trauma of that, not simply to the participants, but to the societies that they left behind, to the societies that they are brought to and changed by their very presence. And the legacy of that ripples through generations of individuals of all nationalities and all colors. That is part of the story that the African-American, that the Museum of African-American History tries to place in context. Okay? In the United States, the founding of the United States, the creation of a nation, there is this paradox between a nation that, in the words of Jefferson, seeks liberty and justice for all, aspires to that, perhaps, but lives in a social reality in which slavery is an integral part of that society. And that is written into the United States Constitution. The very founding documents of this nation include the acceptance of slavery and the attempt to maintain that slavery, at least for the foreseeable future. The question then becomes, can the other part of that, can the aspirational part of that Declaration of Independence and of that Constitution be realized? And that's the paradox of liberty that began at least as early as the 17th century and certainly continued through the era of the American Revolution into the present. Next, please. We talk about and try to illustrate the experience of enslavement in a variety of ways, because there is no one form of enslavement, no one experience. We are very cognizant of that diversity, especially the diversity of gender, in which we have lots of the wake of slavery continues to affect American society together. But this is the kind of display that represents that diversity of looking at the various experience of people of different regions, different regional backgrounds, where they came from in Africa, the religion, the language, as well as the experience in the New World and the new nation. Next, please. Amongst the process of putting together this exhibition, we were very, very careful to not simply collect artifacts, but to make relationships with donors. And it turned out that people, the material evidence of African-American history exists. It exists in people's attics, in their basements, in their garages, in their closets, but they're not sure who to trust it to. when the African American Museum, the National African American Museum, was made public, people began to believe that there was a safe place that they could put their materials and that their stories would be told truthfully. All museum people assumed that there was nothing material left by Harriet Tubman. The Moses of her people during the Civil War, pre and Civil War era, a great philanthropist, a Union spy, the woman who led enslaved individuals to freedom, didn't seem to leave anything. After the Civil War, she was unacknowledged. No one, in many cases, Africa, even many historians had no idea what had happened to her. Where had she gone? She'd gone to Auburn, New York, where she ran a halfway house for indigent women. And in 2009, a bibliographer at Temple University, Charles Blockson, called the director of the museum and said he had some things that he thought the museum would be interested in. The great niece of Harriet Tubman had came to Charles Blockson in the 1960s and had given her a suitcase full of Harriet Tubman's objects, her hymnal, which you see here on the right, and a lace shawl, as well as other books and photographs and jewelry and silverware that Harriet Tubman had used. The lace shawl had been a gift in 1895, very near the end of her life, to Harriet Tubman from Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom. The most powerful woman in the world sought out and found Harriet Tubman and gifted her with this Irish lace shawl as a commemoration of Queen Victoria's 50th year on the British crown. Charles Blockson did not believe this material belonged in his or Temple University's museums. He waited 30 years and then donated this material to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is really a pseudonym for the American public. It's the American public for whom we hold these materials in trust. But creating that relationship and having that sense of trust was absolutely essential to the creation of this museum. Next, please. And so the war came. The contradictions of those aspirations for liberty and justice for all versus the reality of enslavement of 4 million African Americans was too much for the social system to bear, and you ended up with the most one of the most bloody civil wars in world history. Next, please. The museum looks both at the everyday soldier and the women of the war, but also at those figures that we take for granted as part of the large debate. In this instance, Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, two of the larger characters within the story of the Civil War. Next, please. In 1862, prior to the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, President Lincoln emancipated approximately 3,000 enslaved individuals in the District of Columbia. The district's slavery system was set up by Congress, not by individual state legislatures. So the president could, in fact, free the slaves in the District of Columbia when he could not free the slaves in other states. There be no rationale for the federal government to overrule state laws about enslavement. But this illustration, which was colorized after the fact, at least illustrates through the colors the sense of celebration that the enslaved individuals, now free in the district, were able to celebrate their freedom in the way in which they expressed it through their clothing. Remember, in many instances, there was a ban against enslaved individuals wearing clothing that looked like it was fine or ostentatious or even colorful. And therefore, this opportunity of expressing their freedom through their clothing clothing began one of the traditions that has held up through the tradition of Juneteenth and other Emancipation Day celebrations. Next, please. So why haven't we heard more about this? We haven't heard more about this because of instances like this. This was a slave block on the courthouse grounds in Frederick, Maryland, Upper Montgomery County, Maryland. In the 1830s, well, in the 1890s, after the Civil War, the slave block obviously was no longer in use, and yet the local citizens had no reason and didn't want to remove it from a place of honor in front of the courthouse. So they simply, without acknowledging any more, they simply put a plaque on the block, and the plaque read, "General Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay spoke from this slave block in Hagerstown during the year 1830. Andrew Jackson, a slave-owning president of the United States. Henry Clay, a slave-owning senator from Kentucky, made political speeches. Both were running for both were campaigning for the presidency in 1830. Made speeches from this block. So a half century after the end of the Civil War, what is important about this slave block, on which generations of African-American families were split apart and individuals were sold to new owners, what seemed important to the white hierarchy of Montgomery County was that two white politicians, two pro-slavery white politicians, had made speeches there 70 years earlier, and nothing more was said about the slave block. This is a history that has quite literally been hidden right in front of us for the past 200 years. Next, please. After the Civil War, Reconstruction was an era in which there was the possibility of creating a biracial democracy in the southern states due to the presence of federal troops in those states. And with the removal of federal troops from those states, the reassertion of white supremacy, which was the original justification for secession. Maintaining white supremacy was the cause and the result of the Civil War. Next, please. But out of that emancipation of slaves, which was initially enacted, made real in the non-Confederate states in January 1, 1863. It took another 2 years for federal troops and the end of the Civil War in early 1865. It took an additional amount of time for federal troops to make all their way to Texas. And in June of 1865, Major General Granger arranges to have his troops land in the port of Galveston, Texas, and announce to enslaved individuals 2 years later that they were in fact free within a series of restrictions. Next, please. That opportunity was seen by the African-American community as an opportunity for jubilee, for celebration. And so we have newspaper accounts of events that are celebrations. In this instance, a barbecue was given near the city of Austin, Texas, attended by at least 2,000 people. Speeches were made by the governor of Texas, as well as other white legislators and civic leaders. It was a most interesting sight to see so many of these people celebrating their freedom. They came in carriages, buggies, wagons, and on horseback. They were all well dressed. The women looked neat without any display of finery. Good humor and contentment beamed from every countenance. They deserve and appreciate their freedom. Obviously written from the perspective of a white journalist and published in a white newspaper. Next, please. By 1871, the Houston Union was able to report that there was an Emancipation Day 6 years after the order of General Granger, announcing the emancipation of African Americans in Texas, that there was an observance of Emancipation Day in Houston. And within a year of 1871, by 1872, the Black citizens of Houston were able to purchase land in Houston for a park that would become the site for annual Emancipation Day or Juneteenth Day celebrations for decades. So in Texas, in specific cities of Texas, Juneteenth takes on a reality and builds its own history as early as the very early 1870s, within 6 years of the first announcement of the Emancipation Day. Next, please. But the end of Reconstruction leads to the era of segregation, the rise of Jim Crow. Next, please. And it's the Jim Crow laws, not merely the legislation, state by state, which is on the wall directly in front of you, but it's the way in which that law, those legal changes, are enforced. First, by personal violence, which Ida B. Wells has to combat through her anti-lynching campaign, but also by broadly social terrorism, epitomized by the Ku Klux Klan, represented by the white hood on the right side of this particular display. Next, please. And again, this is not a story that is one-sided. This is a story in which we look at the various ways in which resistance and resilience are part of that story, as well as accommodation and oppression. Next, please. So we look at the variety of ways in which African Americans come together in the face of those Jim Crow legislation and restrictions on their freedom for the creation of associations, civic associations, religious affiliations, and the establishment of a economic opportunity through entrepreneurialism, all of which amount to creating and building national institutions toward the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Next, please. And that kind of respectability, if you will, represented by the image that you just saw of middle-class African Americans dressed for an event, is contrasted with the kind of stereotypical development, a cultural development which dehumanized African Americans, and the development of these stereotypical figures, which become commonplace, not merely as entertainment, but as household decorations and toys for white children, become part of the cultural underpinnings of Jim Crow. So Jim Crow is legal, it's social through terrorism, and it's cultural through the development of these kinds of dehumanizing stereotypes. Next, please. But in resistance to that, in opposition to that, comes an artistic expressions and the continuation of those civic celebrations of Emancipation Day or of Juneteenth. And Emancipation Day can be in Washington, D.C., it's April 16th. For many African American communities during the late 19th and early 20th century, it was January 1st, the day on which the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. And for others, it's June 19th, as in the June 19th represented by the Texas experience. This piece of music, you will see, was written by Paul Laurence Dunbar, the very famous African-American poet. Next, please. But Emancipation Day, particularly in Texas, was represented by music. Next. By the extreme flaunting of opposition to finery. This is 1906 in Houston. There are a number of similar photographs of these two women, as well as others in heavily decorated carriages and wagons, as well as with their own personal finery. This was an expression of their own sense of the liberation that was represented by emancipation and their joyous celebration of that emancipation and their determination to maintain that emancipated status. Next, please. It was also about remembrance. This is a photograph from Houston, Texas, also about 1900 to 1906. And based on the perceived ages of these individuals, it is entirely possible that these folks had been born enslaved and had lived to this age and are now being not just celebrating themselves, but are being celebrated as those whose resilience had led to and contributed to both emancipation and to the rise of the new Negro in the early 20th century, as it became known in the Harlem Renaissance. Next, please. As I said, emancipation had started and maintained largely in Texas and through some southern states. It grew slowly through northern states in the late 19th century. And here is Richmond, Virginia on Emancipation Day in 1906. These were not small-scale celebrations. They were not held always on parks outside of town. Sometimes they were held right in downtown. And as you can see, this is a group of people of many generations, all celebrating, dressed not in the finery that we saw earlier, but certainly in their best clothes for this celebration in Richmond. Next, please. Emancipation Day worked as far north as Ypsilanti, Michigan, but here it's held on August 1st, 1906, with a trip from Western Michigan, Jackson and Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti to Detroit and return. Actually, they're going beyond Detroit to Sandwich, Ontario, Canada, where there was a large free African-American population of individuals who had escaped freedom and moved all the way north to Canada, getting away from the United States and the slave catcher bill of 1850. Next, please. And so we talk about the 20th century, how one navigates a segregated society. Next. And again, that Emancipation Proclamation, in this case, back to Fort Worth, Texas, which is now clearly advertised and celebrated here with a two-day celebration. And again, on June 19th, as while it's called Emancipation Proclamation, it's the anniversary. Juneteenth was colloquially a phrase that was often used. But this becomes a more entrenched program by this time. Next, please. The museum covers the military experience, as I said. This is a World War II training plane specifically made to train the Tuskegee Airmen as the first African Americans in the U.S. military Army Air Corps. It's the only surviving Tuskegee airplane that's known to the historic preservation or military history communities. Next, please. And coming out of World War II, places like Atlanta, Georgia, managed to hold the kind of celebration as best they can. But still, this is the beginning of a parade through downtown Atlanta in 1946. We'll come back to its importance in a minute or two. Next, please. The museum deals with the classic civil rights movement, with the dress that Rosa Parks was carrying when she was arrested off of that Montgomery City bus in 1955. And one of the seats from the Greensboro, North Carolina Woolworth store from the 1961 sit-in, both of which have antecedents. Those were not the first bus boycott. That was not the first sit-in, but they are the ones that triggered the vast outpouring rather than a small trickle of those events in earlier years in the 1950s, but certainly the precursors to the classic civil rights movement, if you will. Next, please. Moving right through the 1963 March on Washington and Dr. King's evolution, the change in his attitudes over the years, a sense of his broadening the sense from civil rights to human rights and economic equity. Next, please. And a certain difference of opinion, difference of attitude with the Black Power movement, evolving out of the mid-1960s and certainly taking root in 1968. Next. Represented most dramatically by this 30-foot long plywood mural that was erected in Resurrection City, the site of the 1968 Poor People's Campaign, Dr. King's last campaign, a multiracial campaign for economic equity that he unfortunately was not able to participate in, having been assassinated a couple of months before the event. Next, please. And so we deal again with the traditions and the experience of the civil rights movement through protest and electoral politics, the winning of City Hall, all based on the success of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Next, please. In 1971, the city of Milwaukee becomes the northernmost major city to have a Juneteenth celebration. There are two stories about where that celebration came from. One is that people came back from the Poor People's Campaign and were so struck by the kind of mass attention that being on the National Mall and the pride that came from that effort to continue the civil rights movement beyond the federal legislation, encouraged individuals to have a commemoration of Juneteenth. The second story is that a single individual, a woman, had engaged in Juneteenth celebrations in Georgia, in Atlanta, Georgia, like that early parade that we saw. And she came back and talked to her colleagues in a community that was heavily African American and that was suffering economically with the changes of the 1960s. And the community groups who wanted to encourage population and economic development within the North Side Black community of Milwaukee specifically took the Juneteenth opportunity to make it a community day. This photograph is from 1984, excuse me, and the next photograph is from 2008. The celebration is held every year on the same street. It always involves a street fair with lots of vendors and a parade. And in the 1970s and 80s, it drew 140,000 people for a single day celebration in Milwaukee. Next, please. So it's in the context of that end of the civil rights or the continuation of the civil rights movement and the kind of inspiration that that movement gave that allowed this celebration to continue. Next, please. I'm going to move straight through these next slides. Next. But this gives you an idea of what the music, oh, there's Oprah's dress. Whoops, next. Oh, there's a contrast. Public Enemy and Oprah, they're right next to each other. African American culture is not the same thing. Next, please. The 2000s. Next, please. And next. and again, and again, and again. All but one state now recognize Juneteenth. It began with Texas in 1980 and goes up right through 2020. Next. And so the museum tries to provide that context and that understanding and that kind of illustration. You've seen the highlights, if you will, of one half of the museum with this presentation. And I thank you for that opportunity, and I hope you will come visit. And I apologize for going long, but as you can see, it's hard to summarize the depth, the nuance, and the excitement and the contributions of African American culture to the American nation. Thank you for your time.
Well, let me thank you, Bill, for an extraordinary presentation and revealing to us just part of what the African American Museum has to offer. It reminds us that this country was built with many hands, and among the strongest of those hands were African Americans, who continue to not only build the country, but to defend the country. I'm very pleased to have served with President Obama, very pleased to work closely with Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. They continue to build and to lead us, and it's inspiring. It's just a sample, ladies and gentlemen. So for the full experience, particularly as COVID ebbs, please go down to Washington and make a reservation and go in and take a look. But as Bill demonstrated, not only his knowledge, but his passion is so compelling. Thanks so much, Bill. I really, really appreciate it. Let me thank all of us who've been here today. Our incredible young poet, our great leader who is leading this effort of Juneteenth in Rhode Island. And to all of you, thank you very, very much. And we are very, very proud to have been associated with this